Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shekhar Shah at the National Council of Applied Economic Research, and it's a delight to welcome all of you in these very unusual times to the India Policy Forum for 2020. I'll be joined shortly by my co-editors Barry Bosworth and Karthik Muralidharan, who would also, I'm sure, want to welcome you to this conference. Earlier in the year, we debated, the three of us, whether we should actually postpone the conference or perhaps even cancel it, given where the world is today. But then we really did think that it is indeed important to have a conference like this, which focuses on contemporary policy issues and puts forward research that is going to talk about the crisis that particularly India is in, but then the whole world is in too. And so we decided to go ahead with it. And this is obviously an experiment. First time in 17 years that we are doing this. So we will ask for your patience if things don't go exactly according to plan. But hopefully the team at NCAER, which has been working very hard on this conference, has got things into place, and we should be doing a fairly smooth conference. We are spread over 4 days. Today is the opening day, and as usual in the past, the opening day is reserved for a special lecture, and we will be honoring the memory of T.N. Srinivasan with the second T.N. Srinivasan Memorial Lecture to be given by Dr. Pranab Sen, former Chief Statistician of India and Director of the International Growth Center here in New Delhi. I'll just quickly run through and then hand over to Barry and then to Karthik, who I see has joined. Today we will also have the pleasure, after we finish the introductions and the hellos, to felicitate two long-time, in fact from the very beginning, IPF panel members, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, for their Nobel Prizes. And it's great to see them join us from Provence in France. And then after the felicitation, where Karthik will lead, and we'll have some friends sharing their joy at the Nobel Prizes. After that, we will move to the T.N. Srinivasan Memorial Lecture at 7:30 Indian Standard Time, and that will be chaired by Amitabh Kant, CEO of Niti Aayog, and followed by the lecture by Dr. Pranab Sen. With that, let me hand over to Karthik. I do want to just mention to everybody that several of you are in the attendee list where we cannot actually see you, but we see your names. You're most welcome to raise questions by using the Q&A box. Those questions will be with us and will obviously be shared with the speakers and the paper writers during the course of the IPF. And if they choose to, they will address those questions directly or indeed during the IPF itself. Those of us who are, we can only accommodate a certain number in terms of the people that you see on the screen. They will be able to raise questions directly as they might, as if they were at the India Policy Forum at NCER. And so we will have a mixture of the Q&A. We request everybody to keep their mics muted on the panel so that we don't get cross interference. And to remember, very importantly, to unmute yourself when you do want to speak. So with that, let me hand over to Barry Bosworth. Barry?
Thank you. I think this comes through. This is one, I'm just struck by the technology of all this. It really is amazing in just a few years how the ability to do these sort of things has changed. And I think we have a very good panel of papers that have been put together. This is sort of a historic period, but I think all the papers have been revised a little bit over the last month or so to reflect some of the issues that come up because of the crisis in coronavirus. So I think this is an excellent timing for a conference. I hope it works out well. technologically, so far, it looks like it's gone extremely well. So I want to welcome everybody to this. I don't have anything really more to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Over to Karthik.
Yeah, I guess, welcome to everyone. So one immediate part of the technical glitch, I was here since early, but was in the audience part. So I think, bear with us as we work through these technological issues. I think, let me echo one thing. I think we're in incredibly difficult times, and obviously we had some conversations about what the nature of the conference should take, but we felt that this was just an incredibly important part of the landscape of intellectual engagement with Indian policy, and we're delighted that we're able to have this format. And as with a lot of academic conferences, I think, one silver lining in the remote format has been the ability to make this more open and therefore have a much larger audience and participation than would normally be possible. So I think, we're just delighted to make the most of this opportunity and expand the access to the discussions the very rich discussions that we expect will happen in the coming days. So thank you again and welcome to everyone.
So we are actually good on time. And Karthik, why don't we launch into the first part of our program, which is our felicitation for Abhijit and Esther. And I hand over to you because you're going to lead that. And several of us are also keen to make a contribution. So, Karthik, back to you.
Wonderful. Can everyone hear me? Yes. So I think I think it's just an incredible privilege to be able to launch this session and to be able to felicitate Esther and Abhijit, not just for their Nobel Prizes, but really for an incredible lifetime of work that speaks to research and policy in India. I think the special advantage of having a Nobel come so early is that I feel in some cases they're just getting started. And so, the hope is that this allows the work to continue at an even more accelerated pace. So I think the plan for the session is, initially we thought we had less time, but we have a bit more time, so maybe more people can come in. But I was just going to take about 5 to 7 minutes, maybe I'll take a little bit more now, for the broader audience. And of course, the panelists are very well aware of the enormous body and importance of Abhijit and Esther's work over the years. But I thought I would take about 6 to 7 minutes to just summarize succinctly the scale of their contributions that's been recognized by the prize, and also to make some special connections with regard to the IPF and policy in India in particular. I will then turn over to a few designated speakers of the panelists who've known them for a long time, who I've been in touch with, who will speak for a couple of 2 to 3 minutes, giving their own personal perspectives. And I think as of now, the people who are scheduled to speak there are Pranab Bardhan, Dilip Mookherjee, Maitreesh Ghatak, and Shekhar Shah. But if there's anybody else who would like to add, please send me a note privately and I'll confirm that I'll call on you, because we have more time now than we had initially thought we did. So it would be wonderful to let more people come in, and because the initial plan was that we had less time. So I think let me just start with Abhijit. And I think, as some of you may have seen, in an op-ed I wrote within a couple of hours of the prize, I think the most remarkable feature of Abhijit's research life has been the dexterity and the intellectual flexibility and versatility over which he, over an arc of 30 to 40 years, has kind of almost remade himself multiple times in the style of his scholarship. So specifically as economists, I think we know that you should allocate time across activities where the marginal cost equals the marginal benefit. And so, in the 80s and 90s, when data was much harder to get, and the primary insights in a lot of development economics were coming from theory, Abhijit was primarily a theorist, and his best known early work was work in pure theory. And some of his most highly cited papers, including the work on on herd behavior, on social learning, theories of misgovernance. These are kind of classic theory papers. And then moving forward to the late 90s, when you start getting more data, you kind of see him shifting towards doing some incredibly important applied theory work, some of the most famous of which is joint work with Maitreesh Ghatak and Paul Gertler, studying the effects of land reform in West Bengal, where you have a combination of applied theory that's then taken to data, where you then say, here's the theory that gives us some frameworks, but then let's go to the data to see if that in fact holds and is true in practice. And then you've got, of course, the revolution of the last 15 odd years, which is what has been recognized in the Nobel Prize, which is the shift to economics itself becoming a much more empirical field, which is consistent with the dramatically falling marginal cost of collecting data and doing empirical work. And so, and this is, of course, the work that's recognized in the Nobel Prize, and I'll talk more about JPAL institutionally. So I think over and above, and in this period of work, I think it's hard to overstate the importance of Abhijit's kind of frontal leadership in this empirical turn in the profession. It's almost because the profession historically had, for lack of a better word, I would say a bit more of a theoretical bias, and a sense that you needed to be doing deep theory to be taken very seriously as an economist. And when you have somebody of Abhijit's theoretical eminence then leading the charge towards the empirical side, I think that made that transition perhaps faster than may have otherwise happened. And so in this era, some of Abhijit and a lot of this joint with Esther, classic papers have been on just incredibly micro-oriented studies on how do you alleviate constraints to improving school education, something as basic as getting people to take up their vaccinations. So, again, as development economists, we know that there's two broad ways in which you get development. You get it by improving technology and improving productivity, and you get it by improving technology adoption of technologies that are already there. So when you look at something as basic as why are people not getting their kids vaccinated when the present discounted value of something like this is in the orders of, the return on investment would be factors of tens, if not hundreds, just the basic micro-founded interventions to improve compliance and take-up of some of these interventions like vaccinations, just give you a sense of how micro-founded some of this work has been. So, in the course of all of this work, of course, the biggest institutional contribution, which is primarily recognized in the prize, was the founding of JPAL, which itself is kind of really an epochal moment in modern development economics. And I would say, really played a signature role in the transition of the field, not just towards identification and causal experiments, but at a more basic level, just going to the field and disciplining theory and disciplining ideas with actual data, and getting people in the field to understand if in fact the constraints that were posited in the models were in fact the binding constraints on the ground that people were experiencing. So I think, Abhijit, and over and above the intellectual contributions, you could go on and on about, the range of the contributions as a teacher, as an advisor, training generations of younger development economists, including myself, and also being deeply engaged in policy in India. And I think Suman Bery will probably come in and say a little bit about the founding of the IPF itself and Abhijit's role in creating the IPF and actively being engaged in multiple policy conferences in India over the years, as well as with conversations with policymakers at the highest levels. So, I think we are incredibly privileged and grateful as the IPF to be able to felicitate Abhijit's Nobel Prize. And, thank you for everything you've done over the years and being part of this community and enriching everything that we do as both a research and policy community. So, so that's my tribute to Abhijit. And then Esther, again, as I said, in my op-ed, it's kind of almost unbelievable that somebody so young would be winning the Nobel Prize. Is, I think, unambiguously the youngest ever economics winner. And I think it just reflects the sheer body of work and the energy of what Esther's done in terms of fundamentally transforming the economics profession and transforming development economics from being this more theoretical field where just people spent a lot of time thinking about the range of models that would explain the phenomena of underdevelopment, to then just saying, let's roll up our sleeves, get to the field, not just collect data, but think really, really hard about causal effects. And this has really been a revolution. And it's a revolution which I have had a ringside view of, being a PhD student at the time when JPAL was being founded. And, just nobody, I think, would have imagined that it would become in 15 years the kind of force it has. And Esther has been the single-minded force in terms of driving the global build out of JPAL, from essentially starting with 3 or 4 professors based at MIT to a global movement of over 100 affiliated professors, over 6 regional offices, and over 1,000 completed RCTs. And so, in many ways, as Esther, Abhijit, and Michael, the third prize winner, who was my direct advisor, have said multiple times, that they really see that the prize reflecting a movement as opposed to just kind of, and Esther said this at the NBR felicitation, that if you just put together all the other RCTs done by JPAL, even without the work directly done by Esther, Abhijit, and Michael, that there's enough in that volume of work to warrant a prize by itself. And I think Esther's leadership in this, it's again useful to start with some of the specific papers and highlight that this was not really, some of Esther's best known papers, in fact, were not even RCTs. The classic paper in Indonesia, school construction, was a diffs and diffs. The classic paper on panchayat reservations for women in West Bengal was a natural experiment as opposed to something randomized by the researchers. But it kind of was really a coming to age of the causal inference movement to development economics, and the recognition that in developing country settings, that the marginal cost of running an RCT was much lower, both financially and ethically. And if anything, the ethical case for high quality evidence was even stronger in the case of development. And that's because for most programs, governments and nonprofits simply don't have either the financial or the administrative resources to roll out these programs at scale, which means that the case for a staggered rollout where you have a credible control group against which you can evaluate the impact was particularly compelling. And frankly, once you think about it, there's really no good reason not to do it. And I think, making that case again and again with NGOs, with government officials, and having the tenacity to both kind of make the case for it, as well as build the organization that could then deliver on that promise, is kind of, a signature achievement of a sort that has frankly been unseen, I think, in the world of development economics. And so combining the fervor to make the case on the intellectual side, the policy side, and the organizational side to then enable this transformation to happen, I think, is reflected in being the youngest ever winner of the Nobel Prize, because she's really, and I've said this, to them before, that they built this house on which younger, newer scholars are then building additional rooms and floors, but on this foundation, that's been JPAL, which has just been an incredible journey over the past 15 plus years. I think the other parts that's particularly worth calling attention to is Esther's role, not just in driving RCTs, but really in changing empirical standards across the profession. First as the founding editor of the American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, and now as the editor of the American Economic Review, which is the, of course, flagship journal of the economics profession. And so the commitment has been not just in terms of doing the work, but also setting the standards for the entire discipline. And and in particular, with regards to transparency and research standards. So the push for pre-analysis plans, the push to preempt preempt the p-hacking that we've seen. And again, for those not in the weeds of empirical economics, it's easy to forget where this RCT revolution came from, right? It came from as a natural consequence of papers in the 80s that were written along the lines of, let's take the con out of econometrics, a classic paper by Ed Leamer, or, people like Javier Salai Martin writing papers saying, I just ran 2 million regressions or 4 million regressions. So we were at a time when the empirical enterprise was getting seriously discredited, because essentially you could get the stars and significance on the results you wanted to show by choosing what controls you put in or what you chose to ignore. And so the foundational contribution of the RCT movement to kind of the larger empirical standards in the profession has been the push for transparency, has been the push for kind of pre-specifying exactly what your hypothesis is. And then if the result is not there, the result is not there. And so part of the importance of the transparency and the RCTs is also, if the result is a 0, then you have to trust the 0, because if the experiment is well done, then you have to trust the 0, as opposed to think that, oh, I had a theory, it's not there in the data, maybe there's some omitted variable that if I brought back in would bring my story back. And it's hard to overstate just the importance of what seemed completely obvious points to the culture of the entire economics discipline, and how the empirical standards in the entire field have been lifted, and that the RCT movement and JPAL has kind of been at the front, at the frontier, not just of the work they do, but of setting standards for the entire profession. And, along the way, I think, when we think about how JPAL itself has been so effective, I think it's because of the broader network and broader family of people Esther and Abhijit have brought in. But let me just say again and again that the reason this works is because Esther is the hardest working person in the profession. And so it's impossible for those of us who are asked to do things to say no when you just see how much he is doing. And so that kind of moral leadership of the entire enterprise has just been stupendous to watch over the past 15 years. And I think the prize is just, it's one of these things. There was probably no prize that was less of a surprise, in that everybody knew this was coming. I think it's just a credit to the movement and to the prize committee for having, made the announcement perhaps earlier than what a lot of other people would have expected. So, I guess the final thing I should say is, again, how central India has been to Esther's work. Of course, she's also done seminal work in Africa, but some of the best known papers, including the work on education, this long-term partnership with Pratham, the work on reservations for women in panchayats in West Bengal, the work on take up of vaccinations, newer work on police reform. All of this work has been based in India, and Esther is also the scientific director for JPAL South Asia, and in that hat is pretty much the intellectual leader of all the work that JPAL has done in South Asia. So, I could go on, and in fact, I haven't even referred to my notes because there's just so much I have to say. I'm glad that we have the time, so let me just stop here and again offer my deep personal thanks and gratitude to Esther and Abhijit for everything that they've done over the years. A specific word of thanks for Abhijit in terms of his IPF contributions over the years. With regard to my own involvement in policy. So, my first major policy paper was the IPF paper I wrote on education in 2012. As a young untenured professor, it was probably not the most, it's not what you're typically advised to do. And I think Abhijit's encouragement of even my writing that policy paper, and as a discussant, calling it a model of a policy paper, I think, it's easy perhaps for you to not realize how important that was, but those little nudges kind of, certainly played a huge role in my own life in multiple ways. So thank you personally, thank you for the economics profession, thank you for the policy research community from India, and thank you for the IPF. So it's my great pleasure to congratulate and thank Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee for their Nobel Prize.
Thank you so much.
That's very kind.
So let me therefore, as planned originally in the program, I'm going to call on Pranab, Dilip, Maitreesh in that order. And then I have Rakesh, Suman, and Shekhar as the two most recent NCAER Director Generals and the current Director General. So I have the three academic comments first, and then the three policy comments after that. And if anybody else would like to come in and speak for a minute or two, please send me a private message. So Pranab, over to you.
Yes, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you,
Of course, has expressed the sentiments and feelings that all of us have about Esther and Abhijit. In the short time that Karthik is giving me, did you say 2 to 3 minutes? I can only...
Pranab, we are actually doing very well on time. So
you can take 4 or 5.
Yes, please.
I will just
you can take 5. Yeah.
I will add to all that what Karthik said about the great contributions of both Esther and Abhijit, 4 kinds of personal observations. First, some of you may not know, and I feel a matter of personal pride that both Esther and Abhijit and also Michael Kremer were members of a group, international group of researchers that we had funded by the MacArthur Foundation, which ran for more than about 12 years, actually, starting from middle 1990s, an international group on inequality. We had a group which was scintillating group, of which, by the way, Dilip here in the audience was also a member. So I think both Abhijit and Esther did some of their major work as they were very active members of that group. And I think, if I remember right, I came to know Esther during that period. I think Esther was probably still a student at that time. In fact, we started in the middle 90s. Esther, you probably didn't get your degree by that time. She certainly was the youngest member, but she didn't even get her degree, but she was one of the best in the group already. And Abhijit, of course, I know from much earlier time. It so happens that Abhijit's father was my teacher, one of my most favorite teachers of all times. And I used to go to their house quite often. So we've been very close with him as well as the whole family. So that was the first observation that I wanted to mention, how I came to be involved with their research and with discussing with them and also knowing them personally. The second observation is something that Karthik has already alluded to in the context of the India Policy Forum, how influential they had been to Indian policy research. Like in many other fields of many other parts of development economics, in Indian policy research, their work has been transformative. It's really transformed the whole field of policy research. And this research, even though it started with micro-intervention in health and education, the way it branched out, both of their research branched out in a whole range of field. Karthik has already referred to some of the work, like in the field of economic governance and development, like Karthik referred to Esther's work on West Bengal Panchayat, and then Rajasthan, the police reform, and then more recently, their work on e-governance, their work on managerial incentives, their work, Esther's work on environmental regulations, their work on the information networking. In fact, I don't know how many have seen their paper on the use of gossip in spreading information in Haryana villages. So the range is astonishing. Not just, even though it started with micro intervention in health and education. And this is, I'm talking only of Indian policy research. And then of course, one can talk about their research in other countries. Third personal observation that I want to make is that in a world of right now, and of course for quite some time, we are living in a world of macro pessimism. And I remember in one of their two best-selling books, there's a chapter in which they talk about some cheerful news, even in a world of macro pessimism. How at the margin, even if you work at the margin, even you work with small issues, these small changes, first of all, you convince people that even at that level, micro level, you can show convincingly, statistically convincingly, how you can show things work. And once you go on doing it, as they have been doing and their followers have been doing, very soon you build up a very large total, and the incremental changes end up being a very large change. And that is a bit of cheerful news in the world of research at a time when many of us are really seeing gloom and macro pessimism. And I think, as I said, in one of their books, in a chapter, they mention this particular contribution of working at the small level and how that builds up to a large change. The last comment that I want, personal observation that I want to make is that I think Esther famously has said that economists are like plumbers. I, of course, I heard her saying that, I, of course, immediately remembered Keynes, Maynard Keynes, saying that economists should have the humility to realize they are like dentists. They're useful dentists. But in that context, let me just say that just as Keynes was not confined to being a useful dentist, if you look at Keynes's vision and Keynes's contribution, he was one of the greatest economists of all times. I would similarly think that even though Esther and Abhijit may be useful plumbers at a time when much of the system is clogged, I think their contribution go much beyond. I simply think they are both great economists. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranab. Yeah, so good. I think we have 25 minutes, so that allows, I think, I do want to save about 5 minutes each for Esther and Abhijit at the end. So maybe we will go back to 3 to 4 minutes. So Dilip and then Maitreesh, and then I'll get Rakesh, Suman, and Shekhar in that order.
Hello, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Well, Karthik asked me just a few hours ago to say a few words, and then of course he gave us 3 minutes each, and spoke for 15 minutes himself, and with his usual eloquence. And Karthik can pack in 3 times as many words as anybody else. There's very little left to add to what he had to say. So I just thought, this is the India Policy Forum, and I thought I would speak a little bit more about their academic and institutional contributions outside India. It's utterly transformative, their their work, they transformed the landscape of modern development economics from a sleepy backwater in the 1970s and the 1980s to one of the most vibrant and active currents of the mainstream, attracting the best and the brightest amongst young people. Karthik, for instance, or Maitreesh. So Abhijit, who I know a little bit better, and we come from a similar background in Calcutta, and I also was taught by his father, and who was an incredibly important mentor and influence on my life. But Abhijit's early work, like many of ours, was in theory, and his early work with Andy Newman on sort of the dynamic implications of information frictions and credit market frictions for underdevelopment was really a big milestone. Esther, respectively, her empirical work, equally pioneering on gender, on intra-household conflict, on education, and then on governance, the work with Raghav Chattopadhyay on the effect of Pradhan reservations in West Bengal. All that was their sort of pre-RCT period. And there's also a little gem of a paper the two of them wrote together on information problems and sort of reputational problems in markets, and how, so they have this paper on Indian software exports and the struggle that small firms face in the absence of an established reputation. Let me also now talk about their contribution in training a whole new generation of young people. I walked into Abhijit's office last year, I think, and there was this, I forget, it was a poster, I think, given to him by grateful students. It was kind of a family tree of Abhijit students. And I think, starting, with the 90s, by year and dissertation topic and so forth. And I think there were almost 100, and they were the best and the brightest names in development economics today. So, and those have sort of generated multiplier effects, and they in turn have generated students that have sort of, propagated his influence. Their influence in creating research networks. BREAD, I was, very much at the inception of these original meetings, planning BREAD. And at that time, it was, it was partly because NBR didn't want development in it. Marty Feldstein didn't think development was really a worthwhile, endeavor or part of the mainstream, or not relevant to the American economy, whatever. And so BREAD was sort of created in its place, and Abhijit was the first president, and Michael as well. And then sort of kept up the struggle to create a development group in the NBR. And then when Jim Poterba took over, Jim was very receptive, and then the moment was ripe, and struck the iron when it was hot, and NBR development came about. Esther's role in editing, the inception of the American Economic Journal applied, and then now the chief editor of the American Economic Review. Now development economics is certainly no longer, a sleepy backwater. Their role in creating JPAL, of course, is very well known, but their continued sort of engagement in policy, their presence at the IPF over the years, they're writing books for a broad audience. So, all in all, I mean, it's a combination of intellectual, fundamental intellectual contributions combined with these institutional contributions. That is really what, why they have been as, their contribution has been as overwhelming as it is. Despite all this, they're remarkably humble, approachable people, passionate intellectuals, and compassionate human beings. So I think it's been my great privilege to have known them, to learn from them, to be their friend. And on behalf of the entire community of academics and policy, express our heartfelt gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you.
very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dilip. Let me get Maitreesh.
Hi there. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think most of the points that one could think of in felicitating Abhijit and Esther have already been articulated. So I'm just going to make a few personal observations. So first of all, I was, I think, one of Abhijit's earliest development students. So, and exactly as Dilip described it at that time, I was at Harvard at that time, and Abhijit was briefly there before moving to MIT. Only those who apparently failed the micro or macro, first year exams took development as a soft field or easy field. That was the reputation. It was like all reputations not quite right, but it was clearly viewed as not a very hard field. And Abhijit, along with Jonathan Modoc, taught first kind of modern development economics course, and we were all very excited. And indeed, I still remember that he even put in Lucas Stokey Prescott's formidable dynamic programming book as a background reading to that reading list, so which I think acted as some kind of a screening or filtering device of for those who did think of development as a soft field, or if you struggle with micro macro generals, that's the field to take. But anyway, fast forward 2.5 decades, and there we are. It is, what was kind of a really sleepy backwater, to use Dilip's phrase. We have a megapolis. We have a huge city with all sorts of, bustling with life. And in particular, again, a lot of the things have been said and also broadly understood in this audience. Doesn't really bear repeating. So I genuinely think that one of the, if one takes sort of a cold and objective look at how the field has changed over the last 2.5 decades, I think the primary contribution of Abhijit, Esther, and Michael has been integration of the holy trinity of theory, empirics, and policy in the field of development economics. I mean, all three were always there. I mean, nobody in the 60s, 70s, 80s, everybody understood that theory was important and that evidence or empirics was important and policy was important. I think what we have really seen over the last 2 decades especially is kind of a symbiotic and a syncretic approach where it's hard to really disentangle in a say given paper and kind of just focus on the theory or just focus on the empirics or just focus on the policy stuff. So I think that is something that in a way was, I think is a kind of primary a way in which the field of development has changed. And as somebody who has been teaching development at the graduate level for decades now, I can see this in the way we approach the topic, and the students appreciate this. And that I think is a hugely important contribution. So it's no longer enough to say, hey, under these mechanisms, credit markets may not work as in the perfectly competitive model. We could have credit constraints, credit rationing, etc. There are also tests. And again, one of the papers of Abhijit and Esther that I have continued to teach for a while was this relaxation of the privileged lending part of Indian bank that they studied, and what then happened to firms that were earlier not included, then included, and then again excluded. So once again, from then you have the policy implications. Okay, is it microfinance that's going to do it? Is it credit subsidy that's going to do it? And this is just a credit example. And in each of the various broad topics of whether from land to governance to credit to insurance, their footprints are very obvious. And I think I want to, the institution building, creating a whole cohort and generation of students, of which now I feel unduly senior, being among Abhijit's early. Abhijit was pretty young then too, and And Esther and Abhijit and I have also joined paper. Esther also, I've known him from her graduate school days. So it's really a kind of amazing journey this has been. So the only other point I want to make before letting the other speakers come in is Pranab had an article in the Handbook of Development Economics some time ago, which had the title, I think, The Economics of Development and the Development of Economics, which is a nice title. So in some ways, I think Abhijit, Esther, and Michael's work in the case of development economics and the leadership, and as they often and very frequently point out, it's not just their own work, but the whole range of work in which even those of us who are not primarily RCT practitioners, but we fall part of this, we are part of the ecosystem in terms of combining theory, empirics, and policy. I think it really has had a first order effect on how the profession of economics has changed in a way. Now, if you look at how a lot of labor economic studies, public economic studies, etc., that this is where I think, because perhaps it was, there were more problems out there in developing countries. It was in certain ways, certain advantages of doing surveys there. All of these have contributed essentially now. Development economics has been kind of almost an engine, or certainly one of the engines that has been pulling and influencing the field of economics as a whole. And in some cases, in the case of, say, behavioral economics, there's a nice synergy between what's happening to behavioral economics and development economics. And I think that too is another major contribution of the research agenda that Abhijit and Esther, along with Michael and I, have really provided leadership to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maitreesh. And we'll now turn over on the policy side to the current and the two most recent Director Generals of NCAER. So we'll start with Rakesh, and yes.
First, thank you very much, Shekhar and Karthik and Barry, for continuing with the IPF and the NCAER tradition of fine academic work along with getting people together. It is the National Council of Applied Economic Research, so I'm glad you take this seriously. Karthik, Pranab, Dilip, and Maitreesh have spoken at length about the academic contributions of Abhijit and Esther. I am also very happy that you give me this privilege of speaking at this occasion, and of course expressing really our pride in their winning the Nobel Prize last year. So the warmest congratulations, even though it's a bit late. And it really does fill us all with great pride to have among our colleagues to get the Nobel Prize. The previous speakers have spoken at length about the academic contributions, so I won't speak about their path-breaking academic contributions, nor their teaching that they have talked about and spawning a whole branch of economics, nor am I qualified to do so. So I will speak really much more about Abhijit's personal qualities that I have observed over the last many years that I have known him. Esther, I have not had the privilege of knowing you personally enough, so you'll forgive me if I talk only about Abhijit today. And what this means, of course, is you have to get to me more personally better so I can speak about you the next time. The thing that strikes me most about Abhijit is that given everything that he has done, he has achieved, spawning a whole field in economics, the very, very few academics in any field, let alone economics, who actually spawn a whole field. Having done all this and achieved all the honors that he achieved, Abhijit remains a modicum of modesty. His personal style remains that of a modest, humble academic, unless he's been fooling me all this time. I've never seen him pull rank in any discussions, as many academics do, regrettably. He gives equal time to any humble student, senior professor, middle professor, etc., and is always interested in the substance rather than the form. Nor have I ever seen him getting hot under the collar. I don't know how you do that, Abhijit, because in many discussions, there are always good reasons why you should have got hot on the collar, but you never do. Um, Another quality which I really don't understand is how generous he is with his time. Um, just the fact that he has attended, I think, just about every NCAR, NIMRANA, and IPF conferences, which means 2 trips a year to India, along with all the others that he's making. I don't know how he does it. Both Abhijit and Esther, given all the teaching that they do, running of JPAL, running around, Esther, chief editor of the American Economic Review, writing of books, papers, etc. How they do all this, I'm convinced now that there must have at least 3 duplicates who they're sort of at the same place, in 3 places at the same time. On a very personal note, given in his generosity of time, that the few years that I've been teaching here at Yale on the strategy of economic development, he has agreed to come and speak to my class, even though my class actually is almost the opposite of the work that they do, because it's called strategy of economic development at the macro level, and going back to development economics from the 50s, etc. But his run down from Boston, taken the train in the morning, given the class in the afternoon, and go back to babysit that he has to at a particular time in Boston. So how he does all this, of course, remains a mystery to me. And maybe they could write a book on this as well, on how they manage their time and do all their work and be personally gracious to their friends as well. I don't want to end before making a mention of his mother. I'm probably the only person in this group, maybe Dilip may know her, since he talked about having been together in Calcutta and being taught by his father. I had the privilege of working a little bit with Nirmala Banerjee, his mother, in the early 1980s, when I was in the Planning Commission working on urban development, at which time, of course, no one else in India was interested in urban development, but his mother was, because she was doing a great deal of very compassionate, empathetic work with the informal sector in Calcutta. I have not met her since, but I can just imagine her pride in what Abhijit has done. And also, I presume that having known a little bit of her at that time, that many of the qualities that I just described Abhijit perhaps come from his mother, having known his father. I will end by making an appeal to Abhijit and Esther. You've now done the work you've done for many years. You have a whole army of people, maybe larger than the Indian Army, working on RCT across the world. So may I make an appeal to you? Now just ditch this work and shift your attention to development macro. It is also in need of combining theory, empirics, and policy. It's a complete desert. Having worked on that side most of my career, I know how big a desert that is. So just ditch what you've been doing. You've done enough. You have a whole army of people working. So just shift your attention to macro development, and the world will be much better off. Thank you very much, Karthik.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rakesh. In fact, it's only when you teach graduate development that you realize how broad Abhijit and Esther's footprint is. It's almost like when I teach micro development, I first get people to read their macro handbook chapter in growth theory through the lens of development economics. So in that sense, I think the macro picture is very much on the radar. And, I'll let Abhijit and Esther speak about, about new work they may do there. So I guess we are at close to time. So I'll get Suman in for a minute and Shekhar in for a minute. And then before turning the floor back to Esther and Abhijit for at least a few minutes each.
Okay, I hope you don't mean a minute. I'll need at least 2. Just to say, to echo much of what has been said, but this is an important opportunity to provide the most profound thanks to Abhijit and Esther. Many of you who have been on the IPF know that the real intellectual progenitor of the IPF is Abhijit. We met in Michigan when I knew that I was returning here, and I'd had a chat with Bob Lighton at Brookings at that time about what the model was of the Brookings papers on which the IPF has been modeled. And, essentially what I discovered later was that in contrast to a referee journal, the way something like the IPF works is you get enough talent in the room that people are not going to um, produce schlock. And so the real challenge was to get enough people on the panel, and that was Abhijit's contribution. He helped convene the group that has continued. Somebody like Rajneesh, I think I only met because of Abhijit. And so, the quality of humility, generosity, and time management that everybody has talked to is just obvious in that. And Shekhar will speak next, but the fact that people of his eminence and Esther's eminence have chosen to come to the IPF has, I think, raised the standard of Indian empirical work, and we must acknowledge that. So generosity and farsightedness, those are values that we've benefited from. I would just like to make two points that are more, as it were, current. Firstly, we are in an age where, as it were, evidence-based policy is being massively devalued around the world. And the issue of what think tanks and the rest of us who believe in evidence-based policy can do about it, I think, is an issue. I think that the whole, if you like, field got a body blow at the time of the global financial crisis. There's a sense that the economics profession let them down, and that what we've ended up with is an economic system which is grossly unequal, and that we have nothing to say. So I would say that for the IPF and for them in particular, the issue of not only generating the evidence, but giving tips on how evidence can actually be mobilized to change minds is pretty important. And my final point, I've known Esther less well than Abhijit. I do have this relationship with Bruegel in Europe, and having, in a sense, known American academics for longer, there has been this basic sense that Europe somehow is the backwater, they're the softies, and it's really America that leads the way. I'd just be, I'm aware of Esther's engagement with the European intellectual landscape, and I think that that we may be at something of a turning point, maybe not in the level of, in the quality of the departments, but I think in terms of, as it were, where the world looks to for a role model on policy, it may well be that Europe's day is yet to come. Thank you, Karthik, and Esther and Abhijit. Thank you for for all the generosity over so many years.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Suman. Shekhar, do you want to take a minute, and then we'll.
Thank you. Thank you, Karthik. So much has been said, and every bit of it I fully support and agree with. I first met Abhijit and Esther, I believe it was at Neemrana, and that was a meeting that still stays in my mind for the absolute and complete engagement that they had during those 2.5 or 3 days. We have Esther, I believe there's a video interview we did with Esther, and she talked about how the Neemrana conference had shaped her research agenda. And that was just so incredibly generous of her, given the influence and the role that she had already started playing. And I believe that in another interview, Karthik spoke about how when he was Marty Feldstein's RA and first came to Neemrana, was so influenced by the presence of Esther and Abhijit, and I believe there was a third person as well, and how that took you into the work that you, of course, have been doing on RCTs and in education in particular. The entire NCR community, and I speak for all my colleagues at NCR, but also all the participants at the Nimrana conference, really owe a huge debt to Abhijit. His presence every time. And I know that if T.N. Srinivasan were with us and we are going to have a lecture that's about data and the current coronavirus crisis, that in some sense has also been inspired by the kind of contribution that Esther and Abhijit have made to evidence-based policymaking and to the collection of field data. I want to spend a minute here about how influential the RCT process, where you identify an experiment, you either construct it or it's a natural one, and how PhD students have been thrown into collecting that data. That has had a huge influence as well on NCR, which isn't just a think tank, but unlike most other think tanks, does a lot of primary data collection. And so that's another influence that both of them have had on NCR. Again, I want to thank both of you for being with us. It's really generous of you, and our warmest congratulations for the prize, and Abhijit for carrying on the very proud tradition that your father, Deepak Banerjee, and of course Nirmala Banerjee have led you into. I understand it was your father, who suggested that when you went to presidency, you take up economics, and we are so glad that he actually nudged you in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, I guess in planning the session, I asked Abhijit, and he said you didn't want to speak that much, but there's no getting away from please coming in and offering some of your own remarks before we end the session. And that's for both of you.
Thank you. That was incredibly generous, almost so generous that it's hard to speak after that. I must say that's part of the reason I was reluctant. That just after this, what do you say? Everyone was incredibly generous, and many of you, and knowing how many times you all know that how big a place that plays in people's lives. You are all, so many of you know exactly that experience. You know that we've been extremely lucky. Somehow it has worked out. So I think it's been so. Your generosity is all the more evident from that, because I feel that you also know how important it is to be in the right place at the right time. I think we were very much at the right place at the right time, and I appreciate your words. It's hard for me to take them very seriously. I wanted to say one thing about IPF, which I think is somehow always been, I've always felt very close to IPF, and for a reason. I remember, I think Suman mentioned this kind of in passing, but I want to emphasize that in the early discussions of IPF, I remember calling Suman and saying, it's very important that IPF be a forum for which has no political slant. That we want to have people who do good research, and it doesn't matter what the answer is. We have to start from, and I remember calling him from Boston, and I don't know if Suman, you remember, you were in Delhi, and we talked about it, and I think that was very important for, I think, creating it as an institution of the kind it is, which is, it values above all just quality. And it's actually very rare to have a kind of a policy publication that's so kind of committed. Not all the papers are equally good. There's some really marvelous papers in it. I love, I always mention TN's last paper in there, which I think is wonderful. There's just some absolutely wonderful pieces of work there. Some are not, to me, as good, but I think the general attitude that this is about facts, this is about getting the arguments right, it's about thinking carefully, it's about making the right connection with the theory. That particular just general mindset that I think IPF has always held on to. I think that's extremely important. And that's sort of, I think, always been kind of a support for the work we do. We've always felt that, you know, here's a place where if the argument isn't right, if the data isn't ready for the analysis is being put to, if the empirical strategy is wrong, somebody's going to say it. In particular, TN would say it. Usually it will be TN, and would say it in a way that's sometimes a bit withering, but nonetheless, always accurate. I've never seen TN being wrong on his comments. Sometimes I would have toned it down a little, but it was, and I think that tradition, which is a tradition that, in a sense, TN and Pranab created in the sort of doing micro-empirical work on Indian data, high-quality micro-empirical work. I think this is a tradition that that we've been carrying on in IPF, and I feel very proud of being part of it. So I'll say thank you to all of you. Thank you for those kind words. Don't believe them. And I'll pass it to Esther.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking everyone who spoke so kindly. Karthik, Pranab, Dilip, Maitreesh, Rakesh, Suman, Shekhar, you're very gracious as usual. I also want to second everything Abhijit said, and maybe I didn't think, you know, being in a position we were, I didn't think I would be in a position where someone I would want to say would be said by someone, and then Shekhar managed that anyway. So I wanted to say, India is where my education was completed, to the extent it's completed. That's where I learned to be an economist. That's where I learned to be a development economics. That's where I learned to observe and wonder and question the world. And the IPF and Nimrana conferences in particular, which I started to attend where I was just a child, I think. Actually, unlike MacArthur, where I snuck in as a graduate student and under the guise of bringing the coffee, I think I started IPF and Nimrana. I was at least an assistant professor. I think Karthik was younger than me, and it was actually quite exciting to see him there. But at this age, it was just this incredible sandbox where you had this experience of intertwining economics and policy. And coming to each of these gatherings, and as Shekhar pointed out, listening quite intently, I kept being reminded of why I decided to do economics and not something else, which was to change the world in some sense. And it was really an incredible thing when I started, and I did continue to have the chance both to see some of the hero of development economics, like Dilip and Pranab, who I think exaggerate in saying it was a backwater when they were active in it, and some of the finest theory was being done there. And actually Pranab was in the field collecting data to test theory before I was, you know, finishing high school. So those were, for me, those were titans in the field. And I could see both of them. And at the same time, people that you think you will only read in textbooks, like the architect of Indian economic reform, like Montek or Rakesh or many others. And so that experience was really something that was unique, and is still something that is unique every time I go. This level of seriousness on both sides that I really don't see much of another forum where you get that anywhere. They probably exist and I'm not in them. More generally, in the India side to IPF, I really want to add my thanks and my gratitude to the team that built JPAL South Asia, and in particular to Nachiket Moore, who had the inspiration of letting us start it. And Nachiket has that fantastic vision that few have. And to Shobini Mukherjee, who was one of its first employee and has been his executive director for many years, and has done when we talk about JPAL, when you talk about the whole randomized control trial as being a movement, nowhere than in India is it more apparent. When you have a juggernaut like JPAL South Asia with hundreds of staff members, thousands of field staff, dozens of partnerships with state government and line ministries, dozens of researchers like Karthik and many others who are doing their best work there, then you really think this is what the movement looks like. And there is nothing in this movement that would have been possible without the dedication, the incredible intelligence, and the hard work of people who make it run, and in particular of Chauvigny. So, and also I want to add to that one last person who I think embodies this like wonderful cross of policy and academic work and putting your hand on the grease is Iqbal Dhaliwal, who is both the executive director of the whole of JPAL and scientific director of JPAL South Asia with me, and of course comes with this India policy tradition, being, as we are always reminded when we meet anybody who is anybody, that he was a topper in the IAS exam. And just to conclude, if we had any desire to rest on our laurels and take some time to, breathe or study macro or turn to the lecture circuit full time, the COVID crisis reminded us why we are doing what we are doing and why it's as important as ever. And there again, I want a hat tip to JPAL South Asia, to JPAL in general, and to JPAL South Asia in particular, in how quickly and nimbly they have managed to tilt this incredible ship, like on a dime, to start putting a lot of our manpower, woman power, and existing base of knowledge, and just research infrastructure to shift to COVID-related policy priority for the country, both on the health side and on the economic side, on the lockdown, etc. And that is something which I think is the credit to the staff, from the lowest staff member who had to learn to do survey on the phone, and of course, all of the researchers who just reoriented their research priority in the middle of what was for most people also huge personal upheaval. And when you see something like that, you just feel proud to be a part of it, and incredibly lucky that it's our names that happen to be attached to it at this moment. And I'm hoping that our names will be forgotten when the many people who have come into our house and added buildings make it so much better that our little basement room will hardly be remembered.
Thank you. I guess the one place where you miss being there in person is the resounding standing applause that we would all be giving at this moment. And thank you. I think just in the interest of keeping in time, I bring this session to a close and hand over to Shekhar, who will introduce Amitabh Kant to chair the next session, and our distinguished speaker, Pranab Sen.
Thank you, Karthik, and thank you, Esther.
Thank you,
and Abhijit, for not only just your brilliance, but your humility. And I think it's a great contribution to the profession.